Hello and welcome to the Sandy Leong, the History Witch channel. Today we're going to look at the amazing story of the Great Tea Robbery. And I think you'll realise it sounds like fiction when it's being told, but it is a true story. It's the story of this man, Robert Fortune. He was born on the 16th of September 1812. He was a Scottish gardener, a botanist, and a plant hunter. And he was to become an industrial spy because in 1848 the East India Company sent him on a trip to China's interior, an area forbidden to foreigners. And Fortune's mission was simply to steal the secrets of tea, how it growed, how it was manufactured, and of course some plants and seeds as well to go with it. It is actually the story of the biggest theft of trade secrets in the history of mankind. So welcome to the Great Tea Robbery. So by Victorian times, the British demand for tea had become insatiable, and the Chinese had a virtual monopoly on tea. It was the only country to grow, pick, process, and manufacture it wholesale and export it. It was called liquid jade. And the British for over 200 years had been buying tea from China, but the relationship between the British and the Chinese was not great, to say the least. The Chinese didn't make it easy for the British to trade with them, and they never had. There was really nothing much that China wanted from Britain or needed. And so by Victorian times, these plants, these two on the screen here, were driving the trade between the two countries. Poppy, of course, for opium, and Camellia sinensis, the tea plant. For nearly 200 years, the East India Company had sold opium to China and bought tea with the proceeds. China bought opium with the money paid for the tea. So this opium for tea exchange was indispensable to Britain because nearly 1 in every £10 sterling collected by the government in tax came from the import and sale of tea. And these tea taxes funded railways, roads, and other necessities of an emergent industrial nation. Opium also financed the management of India, the shining jewel in Queen Victoria's crown. So this triangular trade in flowers was the engine that basically powered a world economy. And the exalted and celestious emperor in Peking had actually officially banned the sale of opium in China as far back as 1729, but it was still smuggled in for generations afterwards by the British, and the addiction to the opium was widespread, and of course with any addiction, opium, the demand for opium was rising. So in 1839, a Chinese official in the trading port of Canton, who was so fed up with the behaviour of the British and the opium addiction amongst the Chinese, held the entire foreign encampment hostage, ransoming 300 Britons for their opium worth actually about 145 million in today's money. And when the opium was surrendered, the Mandarin ordered it to be spoiled. And this is a statue of him in the museum in Hong Kong. I don't think he was as tall as that because, to be honest, I'm not that short. In response to this ransoming of the British subjects, Queen Victoria was not amused and sent the Navy to the war to keep the opium for tea trade alive. It became known as the First Opium War. That was 1841, and the British won. The wooden junks of the Chinese were no match for the Victorian Navy, and as part of the peace treaty, England won concessions from the Chinese no one had previously thought possible. The island of Hong Kong and 5 new treaty ports: Shanghai, Canton, Ningpo, Fuzhou, and Amoy. As prior to the First Opium War, the British ships had been restricted to docking only in Canton, with no permission to step outside their warehouses that lined the dock of the merchants that lived there. Many actually had never even seen over the city walls, which were only 200 yards from the foreigners' district. With the 5 new city ports, British merchants thought things would improve, but they didn't. The Emperor still forbade Westerners from travelling beyond the newly constructed foreign concessions in these port cities. But it had given the British and some of the other European nations a bigger foothold in China. The Chinese weren't happy about this peace treaty they had been forced to sign. And still today, they call it the Unequal Treaty. And at the same time as this was going on, a new profession was emerging in Victorian England, or Britain, I should say, that of gardeners, men who understood plants. They actually became the new adventurers. They started to feed the Victorian obsession for new and exotic plants by visiting other countries and bringing plant specimens home. Well, the British had been enthusiastic gardeners for a few hundred years, really, establishing botanical gardens in most of their overseas territories. In 1842, when news of the peace treaty broke, the Royal Horticultural Society saw it as an opportunity to send a plant collecting expedition to China. And Fortune was chosen to do this. His task was to study and find the rare plants of the Orient. So he went to China. He visited each concession port, collecting everything he could. But he didn't go into the interior. As I've already said, that was actually forbidden by the Chinese. And these are just 3 of the plant species that he brought back that we have in Britain today. You can see the winter flowering jasmine, the white wisteria, the bleeding heart, and also he brought back many others. And whilst he was in China, he kept a journal of his travels. And so on his return in 1847, he published his account in the form of a travelogue, 3 years wandering in China. I mean, it's a big title because he wasn't wandering all the way through China. He was just in the treaty ports. But the book was a great success. The Times reviewed it, and they said it is pure, almost to a fault, and has to be taken as the Chinese themselves drink tea, without any admixture of milk and sugar, for luscious ornament and superfluous additions. Our single-minded author has none. High praise from the Times. It actually made Fortune's name as someone who knew both about plants and China. And he was then offered a prestigious new job at the Chelsea Physics Garden in London. He was now 35 years old. He had a wife called Jane. He had 2 children, a boy and a girl. They would now live in a house in the grounds of the Physics Garden, and he was in charge of its upkeep and development. Jane was busy bringing up the children, and life would have been comfortable. A nice house, an interesting job, a good salary. He might have been content. But things were to change quite soon. Plans were afoot in Leadenhall Street in London, the headquarters of the East India Company. The subject being discussed was tea and opium. When Elizabeth I had granted the East India Company's charter in 1600, the company had all the trading rights in the East Indies. And for the first 100 years of its existence, it largely brought spices and fabrics in the Orient and sold them in London. and it was all very successful. And as the company grew and trade grew, it became the government of some of the lands where it did business. Actually, if we scroll back to the 1600s, when it all started, tea had come into England in the mid 1600s and had become very popular. And once it was just another commodity for the East India Company, but eventually it became the commodity everyone wanted. This meant trading with China, and this, as I've said already, was a bit of a problem. But the governor of India, a chap called Sandy MRHS, had an idea. He thought that the East India Company should be growing tea in China. No, actually, should be growing it in India. And tea had actually been found growing in India and had been experimented with for about 10 years prior to the First Opium War and the subsequent treaty. But the quality of it wasn't as good as that from China. But Hardinge thought it could be a success and was the future. This is him, by the way. And the British were also worried that the Chinese emperor might upset this delicate balance peace treaty by legalizing opium production in China and breaking India's and therefore Britain's monopoly on the poppy, which would have been a disaster for the British. So the idea took hold in the city of London. This is what he wrote. It's an interesting idea. In my opinion, by no means improbable, that in a few years the government of Peking, by legalizing the cultivation of opium in China, where the soil has already proved equally well adapted with India to grow the plant, may deprive this government of one of its present chief sources of revenue. Under this view, I deem it most desirable to afford every encouragement to the cultivation of tea in India. In my opinion, the latter is likely in the course of time to prove an equally prolific and more safe source of revenue to the state than that is now derived from the monopoly on opium. He was very definite about it, wasn't he? He thought actually that the Himalayan mountain range resembled China's best tea growing regions and they could replicate the quality of China's tea. But there was just one small problem to this plan. They had no good quality tea plants or real detailed knowledge of how to grow it. Well, the British never let small details like this get in their way. So the ideas of Hardinge had taken hold in the East India Company and they had a plan. On May the 7th, 1848, Dr. John Forbes Royals, this chap, he was a botanist and horticultural advisor to the East India Company, was sent to visit Robert Fortune. He came to visit him with a proposition. Would Fortune be willing to go back to China in the employ of the East India Company as a tea hunter? He would have a good salary, he would have his passage paid there and back and all living expenses, and anything else he collected besides tea, so we're talking about other plants, would be his. It was a great offer. He could make his fortune. So Fortune told Royals that he would think about it. We suspect he didn't think about it for long because it is recorded that around a week later a letter arrived from the East India Company dated the 17th of May 1848 confirming the appointment. So he must have got back to them really quickly. And the letter was telling him to be ready to sail to China by June the 20th. The East India shopping list, or maybe we should say stealing list, that Fortune was to acquire was quite straightforward. It was tea seeds, tea seedlings, implements to process tea, and knowledge in the form of tea experts to go and work in India. The East India Company were really planning industrial espionage on a grand scale. So by June the 20th, Fortune was sailing to China. The East India Company had wanted him to arrive as early in the autumn as possible. He landed in Hong Kong. This is actually a painting of Hong Kong Harbour in 1850. It's somewhat different to today, isn't it? And by September of the same year, Fortune had hired a passage on a small flat-bottom boat to go from Hong Kong to Shanghai. In Shanghai, he stayed with Mr. Thomas Beale. He was from a renowned trading company called Messiah's Dents, Beale and Co. It was actually a friend he'd made in his previous trip. This is a picture of the Dents buildings around 1858. He was actually one of the wealthiest merchants at the time, and he helped Fortune find fixers who would smooth his way. So Fortune hired 2 men who would be his interpreters, his cook, his plank collectors, his bodyguards, and porters. They would be his lifeline getting into China where no Westerner had ever been. One he called the coolie. We don't actually know his name. He was to do the manual work. The other one was called Wang. He was an educated chap, and his job was to get him into the tea districts, and he actually came from a tea growing family. But Fortune wouldn't get too far looking like he did, would he? Spot the difference. Look at the Chinese people, the men on the right and Fortune on the left. So Fortune's servant shaved the front of his head and sewed a long braid into the back of his hair. There is no record that he actually shaved off his whiskers, his mutton chop whiskers, but he must have done, mustn't he? His servants then procured him some merchant robes, and dressed like this, he felt a bit safer to leave the British concession. He was relying basically on a new hairdo as he sought to steal one of the greatest treasures of China. And this is what he wrote about having to be in disguise. He said, "They would be quite willing to accompany me, only stipulating that I should discard my English costume and adopt the dress of the country. I knew this would be indispensable if I wished to accomplish the object in view, and readily acceded to the terms." So he took on the persona of a Chinese from a distant province by the Great Wall. So sorted. New hairdo, new clothes. He took on a new name, a bright flower. What could go wrong? Oh, did I mention? He was actually 6 foot 2 inches tall. So he would have stood out, even just for his height. So first he decided he would make the shorter journey to the Hanyu province, where the servant Wang was raised on a tea hill near the Sunglo Mountains in this province. You can see it on the map where it is. He thought the best way to get there was to hire a sedan chair and first go to Hanzu and then on to Wang's family home in the Sunglo Mountains. They began their way to Hanzu, which is about 120 miles inland from Shanghai, and Fortune thought it would be dangerous to go actually through the city. This is the city gates. So he ordered the servants to circle it and keep a low profile. And actually, this was his first taste of things not being as they seemed. Actually, he wasn't really in charge. He was very dependent on these 2 chaps. Because Wang thought it would be quicker and cheaper to go straight through the city. And Fortune actually didn't realise what was happening until they were in the city walls and they'd enter the gate. They did get through, but Fortune realised at this point things weren't going to be straightforward. On the way, Wang gave Fortune face by concocting his identity as a Mandarin and forging a fictitious network of prestigious connections. Of course, that also elevated his own face as being connected with this important person. He also bribed and negotiated on Fortune's behalf, not just for favours, but for this, very important to the Chinese, the face that they needed to get into the places they needed to go. Next, Wang found a passage on a cargo boat heading in the right direction. It was sailing up the Yangtze River. Apparently, Fortune tells us the cost of the passage included 2 meals a day of rice gruel and 1 meal of rice. They were given a straw mat to sleep on, a basin of hot water each day to wash. And Fortune recorded that the boatman told them tales of local terrors and brigands. The tales, he said, were affecting, and he said, it almost made me believe myself to be in dangerous company. I don't know whether he was naive or just very brave. But what we do know is that he really recorded his journey, and so it's made it so much more interesting and accessible for us. Once into the Chinese countryside, Fortune became distracted by the flowers and the plants, and whenever the boat stopped, he went with his servants to collect specimens. On the slow days, he would actually walk beside the boat looking for plants. He really was, I suppose, a British eccentric, but the Chinese had not encountered the British eccentrics. But I do wonder what the other passengers thought of this strange-looking Mandarin. But actually, trouble was brewing. Wang had fallen out with the captain over money. He'd been gambling. And the coolie seemed to have a big mouth, and he told the passengers that Fortune was a Westerner. And that night the crew went ashore. Wang woke Fortune because he thought that boatmen were planning to kill them all. Wang said he heard other passengers whispering this. The crew were going to return with more people, kill them, and drown the false Mandarin. As Fortune looked out, and he actually saw a band of men coming towards the ship, and one came to his cabin, but finding him awake and standing up, he said he looked sheepish and went away. And after that there was a great deal of muttering, but Fortune couldn't understand it, so he didn't actually know what was happening. And so he really had no idea how real or great the threat was. So he decided to stay awake all night, which seems a smart move, really, doesn't it? On the way, Fortune stopped off at a green tea factory, and he was allowed to have a look round. Wang had got him in by saying he was a visitor, an honoured and wise official who had travelled from a far province to see how such glorious tea was made. Well, he certainly had done that. And this was necessary because the East India Company's instructions, I said, were quite clear. It said, beside the collection of tea plants and seeds from the best localities for transmission to India, it will be your duty to avail yourself of every opportunity of acquiring information as to the cultivation of the tea plant and the manufacture of tea as practiced by the Chinese, and on all points with which it may be desirable that those entrusted with the superintendence of the tea nurseries in India should be acquainted, so find out as much as you can. In this factory, tea was being prepared for export, and Fortune saw the fresh leaves set to dry in these large woven rattan plates. They were put to dry under the sun for about 1 to 2 hours. Then he saw the leaves being tossed in a very large wok over a fierce heat, then put on a table and rolled over bamboo rollers to bring out the essential oils, and then back to the drying pans again. They were then sorted by the workers, who chose the most tightly wound leaves for use for the high quality teas like the picos, and of course picking out any stems or insects that had stayed in there. And so Fortune not only saw how the tea was being processed, but he actually saw something that was quite troubling. He noticed those working on the final stages of the process had blue fingers. He actually discovered that they were adding Prussian blue to the tea. And as you maybe know, that is also known as cyanide. And they were also adding Gibson as well. And Fortune estimated that more than half a pound of plaster and Russian blue were included in every 100 pounds of tea being prepared. The average Londoner is thought to consume about a pound of tea per year. Was the tea poisoning the British consumers? Fortunately for the tea drinkers of Britain, Prussian blue is a complex molecule and it needs particular circumstances to release the cyanide ion from it, and the poison passes harmlessly through the body. But it wasn't actually being done as a grand plot. It was done because the Chinese believed the British wanted their tea green, so they were obliging them. But Fortune managed to secrete samples of the poison in the folds of his gown. He actually records in his diary how useful these large pockets were in Chinese robes. And he sent them back to London. And of course, this further strengthened the argument for the British manufactured tea by this discovery. After this stop, they continued to Wang's home in the Sunlow Mountains, and Fortune was to stay with Wang's family, which he records as being very basic. He stayed for a week. He went out each day to pick as many tea seeds and seedlings as he could, returning in the evening to bargain a price. And so Fortune's journey to find green tea was a success. And it's good to know that he did pay something for it, isn't he? He just didn't walk off with them. So he had actually a relatively uneventful journey back to Shanghai with his tea seeds and seedlings. I do wonder if the Wang family asked him what he was going to do with them. Anyway, this is Nanking Road in the Shanghai International Settlement. By January of the next year, so we're talking 1849 now, Fortune was working in a Shanghai garden which occupied some land around the warehouses owned by Dent. He was planting seedlings in neat rows. He'd written to the East India Company of his success. He had 10,000 tea seeds and around 13,000 young plants to ship to India. Again, it was unclear what the businessmen in the settlement knew about what Fortune was doing, because transferring the production of tea to India would have a serious impact on their businesses. Perhaps they just thought he was in the business of collecting plants, like so many Victorian gentlemen were. So Fortune then had 11 Wardian boxes built, so he could send his plants to India in them. These had actually been invented by this guy, Nathaniel Ward, around 1829, so they were pretty new. And this type of box is the sort, when it's sealed, it has its own ecosystem and will keep plants alive and well for a considerable time. So this was 1848. He'd been in China for 9 months. He'd actually heard nothing from the East India Company. He'd sent his haul to Hong Kong for them to be shipped to Calcutta and then to the Himalayas, which was quite a journey. He made meticulous notes of what he'd done, and it would be a few months before he knew whether his shipments had arrived in good condition or not. In March the following year, Hugh Falconer, this chap on the slide, who was the director of the Calcutta Botanical Garden, he'd taken over from Royals, the chap who'd approached Fortune, and he was waiting for shipment to arrive, worrying about whether the idea would succeed, and also worrying about a young man called Jameson who would be dealing with the plants in the Himalayas, and they was wondering whether he was actually up to the job. But the seeds were having a hard time. Fortune had accompanied them to Hong Kong, and then, as I've said, they were sent on to Calcutta. For some reason, the ship was diverted to Ceylon. We don't know why, maybe bad weather or for an extra stop. And Falconer collected the shipment on the 23rd of March, 2 months after they'd been shipped, which was a long time. He was very careful not to disturb the Wardian cases. He peered at the plants through the glass, and as far as he could see, they all looked okay. He arranged within a few days to get them on to a steamer heading for Allahabad, halfway to the Himalayas. But when they got there, an official did the worst thing possible. He was doing his job, but he opened the cases to inspect the contents. And then they had 6 weeks to wait to complete their journey. And this is what arrived. Well, something that looked like that. We don't have any pictures of it. After all Fortune's risks and works, only 1,000 out of the 13,000 seedlings remained just alive. They were ailing, they were full of fungus and mould. Jameson, who received them, tried to save what he could. The seeds were actually a complete failure, not one had germinated. And Fortune wasn't to find out about this failure for a while. Well, perhaps just as well, hey? In May, Fortune set off for the Black Tea district of Fujian, heading to the Wuyi Mountains. This was even a more daring trip because he was going deeper into China. It would take him about 3 months by boat, sedan chair and foot. It was over 200 miles and a lot of it was uphill. He was seeking China's best tea, according to the British, the oolong. He wasn't taking Wang and the coolie with him. He was fed up of their bickering. They just had never got on. And he'd actually sent Wang back to his family home to get more seeds and plants. He was going with just one servant this time, called Sing Hu. He was an educated chap, and he also spoke the local Fukienese dialect, which was extremely helpful. On the steep climb up the mountains, Fortune stopped to sample the wares of the tea merchants, enjoying a cup of pure tea in its native mountains. And this is what he recorded. He said, "We find tea one of the necessities of life in the strictest sense of the word. A Chinese never drinks cold water, which he abhors and considers unhealthy. Tea is his favourite beverage from morning until night. Not what we call tea, mixed with milk and sugar, but the essence of the herb itself drawn out in pure water. One acquainted with the habits of this people can scarcely conceive the idea of the Chinese Empire existing deprived of the tea plants, and I am sure that the extensive use of this beverage adds much to the health and comfort of the great body of the people." Well, he was certainly impressed with the tea, wasn't he? And he also was impressed with where he was going. He said the road, it was a botanist's dream, and Fortune made frequent stops to collect plants. On his way, Fortune stopped off at a monastery, and he was made welcome by the monks, who were generous with their knowledge about tea. He accompanied them on their daily tea tending. He plucked and dried leaves with them. He noted their rituals. He learned the way of tea planters, tea tasters, and tea makers. His servant, Songhua, was actually embroidering Fortune's status. He was elevating it as much as he could to get what they wanted. And at one point, he even told the monks that Fortune was a descendant of Genghis Khan. And he elevated Fortune's status so much that the monks held him in much esteem. And this was why they gave him cutting from one of their most treasured secret possessions, the Dang Ho Pao Big Red Robe tea, which grew on the Wuyi mountain cliff, and you can see some of it there. And this is because of a legend. The legend goes that this tea cured the mother of the Ming dynasty, and the emperor sent a red silk robe to cover its roots to protect it from the frost. It is the most expensive tea in the world. The first picking is worth more than gold. And this, what I'm showing you now, is the Da Hong Po Tea Shrine. And this was probably the only moment of self-reproach Fortune felt when the monks gave him cuttings from these tea bushes. He recorded, "I nearly lost my gravity." It's a wonderful British understatement, isn't it? He left the mountains with many healthy seeds and plants and made his way back to Shanghai. This time he had a more eventful journey. While staying in the opium den on the way back, the servant got into a fight with the porters, and this resulted in all the porters just creeping away in the middle of the night and leaving Fortune and Sunghua alone when they woke up the next morning. So they had to carry their own luggage until they could find some help. But they had got many healthy seeds and plants, and they got them back to Shanghai safely. Now all he had to do was to get these to India. But when he got back, guess what? There was a letter waiting for him that told him about the failure of the first shipment. Of course, he would have read it in dismay. Nothing had been gained for India, for the tea industry, for all his work and effort. So what to do? Well, he started thinking of a better way of sending what he'd just collected. He put the seeds and plants in the warding cases. This time he gave stern instructions for them not to be opened. And this time it was successful. Nobody messed with the cases. He'd actually had stronger ones built. The seeds sprouted on their way to India, so this was a success. Fortune had also recruited 8 Chinese tea experts to instruct Indian growers in the proper planting and processing of the new crop. To entice the men, he offered large salaries and a 3-year contract in India, where they would be in charge of both Indians and English, telling them how to grow the tea. On the quayside in Shanghai in February 1851, 8 tea experts said goodbye to their families. They boarded the Island Queen and set sail for India along with Robert Fortune, who was going with his tea this time. I don't blame him, do you? He had completed his task. Fortune's shipment of seeds and seedlings was a great success. Every tea garden in the Himalayas from then to now are the offspring of Fortune's work, or theft, we might say. Himalayas provided a perfect place for growing tea, and his seedlings brought world-class tea to India. And out of Fortune's theft and ingenuity, Indian tea became a beverage of distinction. Tea, like sugar, coffee, tobacco, rubber, and opium, were amongst the first mass-produced, mass-marketed global commodities. Tea was actually instrumental in moving the British Empire east to places like Burma and Ceylon and other regions where tea could be grown, creating new economies and problems for the countries. Of course, that's a whole other story. Fortune was also sending his wife many plants that he'd found on his travels. She sorted them all out. This is the plaque in Kensington in London, showing where he lived. In fact, this trip that he made turned him into a rich man. But he didn't hang up his boots. He made several more trips back to China, and Jane spent most of her married life alone, bringing up their now 6 children. So, as I've said, he did come back, but only for short spells. By the time the Chinese realised the treasure Fortune had stolen from them, it was many years too late to recoup. And in about 20 years, the tea trade had shifted away from China to the British dominions. In UK, when we have our cup of tea, no thought is given to the bravery or foolishness of what he had risked of Robert Fortune, the tea hunter. A man of his time, the Victorian bent on making Britain great. Well, it's an interesting story, isn't it? And I'm going to leave you to decide on the morals of this story. The British desire for tea actually changed the world and caused what could be called the biggest theft of trade secrets in history, the Great Tea Robbery. Thank you for listening to this video. I'd love you to subscribe to my channel, so please do that before you leave, and hopefully see you again shortly.